Everybody, and welcome to the last session of day 11. My name is Julia Steele. I'm the creator and host of VID21. If this is your first session to VID, welcome. You have picked an absolute cracking session to join. We are joined by the amazing Yasmin Poole. Yasmin is in Melbourne at the moment, but you will find her just about anywhere in the world. She's an award-winning speaker, writer, and youth advocate. She's Plan International's national ambassador and champions the importance of young women being heard in Australia's political conversations. She's also been a commentator on prominent television programs such as Q&A, The Drum, and The Project. Yasmin is the non-executive board director of OzHarvest, Australia's leading food rescue charity, and the YWCA, a national feminist organisation that supports women and girls for 140 years. In 2019, Yasmin was the youngest member of the Australian Financial Review 100 Women of Influence and top 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians. She's most recently been named the Martin Luther King Jr. Centre's 2021 Youth Influencer of the Year. And she's not even finished her final year of university. And I'm just, so this just blows my mind, Yasmin. Welcome, it's such a pleasure to have you.
Hey, Julia, it's good to be with you and good to be with you all.
Thank you so much. We first met in, I think it was 2019 when we were both at Space, which is an event in Byron Bay that's hosted by Holly Ransom and CJ Adam. And I remember sitting in a tent, you hosted a conversation about young people and how, for lack of a better word, the older generations need to start to engage with conversations, or we need to start to engage with each other in conversations about how to include young people in the future conversations about where we're going in Australia and around the world. But how did you come to this place of being a youth advocate? Do you want to start with your story and we can take it from there?
Yeah, I think my journey has been the opposite of a linear journey. And it's funny because when we talk about even my biography, these are all things that, you know, younger me could have never in a million years anticipated. So in a sense, I think I kind of pinpoint the start of my journey to actually year 11 in high school. And it was doing a public speaking speech. And they asked, what do you care about? And as a 15-year-old, that was this question that I'd actually really not thought about very heavily. But in that year, there was a lot of actually Islamophobia going around. It was 2014. So ISIS was really kind of dominating the headlines. And for me, that personally it felt quite personal because my mum is Muslim and I had kind of over my life seen the discrimination that she'd faced and always really felt this sense of powerlessness. And I decided to actually just stand up and speak about it. And it was like in that moment, I felt this shift. I looked at the audience and I connected eyes with this young man that was my age at 15, who was sitting next to his mum, who was wearing the hijab. And we just had this moment of mutual understanding. And it was really the first time I had used my voice to kind of talk about not only my experiences, but almost step into the conversation and realize that I had, despite my age, had a place in talking about my experiences as a vehicle for change. So it all kind of started there, but it was also things like my gap year when I graduated high school and I started volunteering with youth-led NGOs, literally as something just to have something to do because I had all this time, I was working full time. I thought, well, what else is there to do? And I would be in these places of, you know, charities that were run by hundreds upon hundreds of young people. And in a sense, we didn't have power individually, but collectively we were lobbying and creating campaigns and, you know, people that were all from all walks of life, but just spending a couple of hours a week to volunteer and do what they cared about. And I realized that my whole life I'd kind of been waiting in a sense for permission to start. This idea of, okay, well, change is, you know, a man in a suit. You know, that's what leadership felt like and looked like. And I'd never really thought that as an 18-year-old, I could have a say once again. So it kind of gave me the bravery to realize that young people's views are important in their diversity, and that young people's optimism has a real role in shaping how we envision the future. So it kind of, in a way, expanded my worldview in a way that I felt school never did. And it kind of, this feeling of, suddenly this feeling of limitlessness and agency. And it really started me centering, my experiences as a young woman of color, and realizing that is a form of justice that I could pursue. So I'd say it was those kind of experiences that just expanded my ideas of what change really looks like. And it has just been, just like I said, a bit of a roller coaster ride, but one that feels really authentic to me, and something that I think 15-year-old Yasmin doing a public speaking speech could look at with pride.
It's been really interesting the last probably half a decade, as you said, between the religious tension, the race tension, the gender tension, and as someone that's just sort of interested in a lot of those things, there is this undercurrent of youth, and then there is the youth debate on its own. How have you seen that evolve in that time, and what are some of the conversations you've been involved in, and where are you seeing that conversation be accepted or included, and where is there still work to be done?
Yeah, I think the youth debate has evolved in a lot of different ways. And something that really highlighted what youth means and the role of it in this conversation is an experience I had in 2018. And I was chairing the Victorian Government's Youth Congress. So this was the youth advisory body that was advising the Minister for Youth on mental health policy reform. And as we sat in this group of young people in a circle, representing over 1 million young Australians, what was actually powerful is the idea that we weren't just young people. There was a huge diversity of who we were. So there was a young woman from a refugee background, Indigenous young people, young people that have experienced homelessness, lived in rural areas. There was just all this diversity, and it really changed the kind of policies that we put forward. So let's say, young refugee women were talking about the cultural barriers they have to the mental health system, or somebody that is low income was saying, well, I have to work, the mental health hours don't support me. And I think that was really helpful because it showed me there was not one type of young person. There was diversity in our views, but there was commonality in us being young. And that really helped to, in a sense, bring the lived experience of the systems that we face every day, whether it be mental health as one example, but education, employment. These diversity of ideas put forward by young people was important because we were, in a way, stakeholders in this system, but never felt like we had a voice to talk about the youth specific issues that we often faced. So I think it's evolved in a way that I think there's more appreciation that young people, youth isn't the only category. It's a really important one, but there's a lot of different identities within that we have to take into consideration. And I also think the second thing that it's changed is, I think there used to be a lot of comments like young people just want smashed avocado on toast and, super lazy and just ridiculous and silly and stupid, that kind of thing. I like to think that's kind of changed, but I do think sometimes in the way that we include young people is so often tokenistic. So we would create things like youth spaces, but not actually take on recommendations put forward by young people. There's a lot of, in a way, lip service to listening to young people, but little willingness to action that and make it meaningful. And something I've been trying to emphasize is young people, again, are stakeholders in this process. Their views are important in creating more genuinely effective solutions. So, why aren't they in Parliament? Why aren't they in, different organizations is an important sounding board and advisors, again, in that lived experience. So yeah, I kind of see that evolving. So I do see more space for young people and I really welcome that. But I think the next step is, well, how do we give them this, agency and authority that other members of the community also receive?
Find it fascinating, and you used one word earlier around optimism. And I know through conversations that we've had, and also just conversations with people near to me that are, hot on our heels in terms of wanting to shape the future and make a difference, that there is an optimism there, that there is an energy there, that it almost feels wrong to suppress it. And it's just almost, but there is something in our, I don't know if it's society's culture, where lived experience seems to overwhelm that optimism. So it's almost like the man in the suit. You've got to be grey haired, you've got to be 30, 40, 50, 60. You can't possibly know what to change, how to change, because you're not old enough to. How have you overcome that lived experience equation, and the value of perceived value of experience over maybe that energy and enthusiasm that you spoke about?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of hit home actually 2 days ago. So I was recently on the TV show Q&A, and we were talking about consent, which is such a hot topic issue with all the rallies in Parliament and all of that kind of stuff. And it wasn't just me actually on the panel. We actually stopped and listened to a young girl who she asked a question, and she was saying, well, I go to an all-girls school and I've experienced, harassment. So many of my friends have, particularly from all boys schools. And she spent a good 5 minutes talking about her experiences. And that's something that, no matter if you're an expert in this topic, it is different and more, and in fact, really important that we again listen to those experiences, because it reminds us these issues are not abstract. These issues are not far away. These affect young people's lives every single day. So that's not to take away from experts or take away from senior leaders, but it's to say that we all have different perspectives that play an important role. And in a way, again, drawing back to even my first public speaking speech, that wasn't me having a PhD in this field, but it was standing up and saying, hey, I'm the daughter of a migrant woman. Australia still has a lot of ways to go in terms of dealing and confronting racism. And I know we often throw around the word storytelling, but I really think when we think about the history of Australia and the way that stories have so often excluded particular groups, let's say women, and diversity of women within that equation, those different perspectives are important in challenging our ideas of justice, of power, of fairness, of equality. All of these ways are important in advancing our society as a whole. So I never kind of claim to know everything. I never claim to speak for all young people, but at least I can start that conversation by saying, hey, we have a lot of issues from all the way from employment to climate. It's young people's not only optimism, but ability to think outside of the box, because we haven't been in that box for very long. That is, in a way, helpful to predict the future and where we're going to go, because young people will eventually be in these leadership positions. It's almost like when we talk about climate, young people are waiting to kind of get into positions of power. Well, what if we tap into that energy now? Imagine how better served we will be to deal with these issues in the future than wait until young people become middle-aged and older. So that's kind of how I frame that.
Yeah, it's I find it quite fascinating when I look at, there's a couple of things in what you said. One is that some of the best answers may come out of people that haven't been in the box, right? That haven't got the jaded opinion, that haven't got the preconceived idea of the right way to do something, that they are willing to challenge because they've never done it before. But then there's also groups of people that I see and I go, well, there's so many problems around the world at the moment that doesn't discriminate on age, right? You don't have to be old to be poor or to struggle with mental health and well-being, or to look at education or want to have a family. You don't, or what am I? I'm trying not to get frustrated, because sometimes I look at government and I just want to go,
oh, trust me, I feel you, Julia.
but the answers need to come from that space as much as everyone else, and not just from what's perceived to be the large of the voting base, if that makes sense. Like, as you said, the majority of voters are going to come out of the young 20 to 30 space. They're going to have more and more influence, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's a couple of questions. I'm just going to jump into a couple of these because I think they're nice segues to what you were just talking about. So Sue said, we've seen this in New Zealand. So she's over in Wellington, with advocacy and advisory groups not managing to have their recommendations heard or taken seriously. Have you managed to find the secret sauce to break through the barriers?
Great question. I don't know if there's necessarily one way to break through those barriers. I think the reality is, look, Australia is currently led by a more conservative government, and the reality is youth often don't vote towards for that government. And I think that does affect young people's ability to be heard and prioritized in that space. And that's a real reality that I think a lot of youth issues, at least youth organizations, have had to deal with. So I think there's kind of different ways to viewing the problem. I think that what has helped, at least with Youth Congress, that felt different was, and something I've been pushing for, is how do governments actually create spaces for young people? So things like a youth advisory board within government. And that's not the only way for young people to be heard. And quite frankly, it shouldn't be the only way. There is a multitude of other issues that can't be captured in just a youth advisory board. But my question is, how can we change the framework of our democracy by ensuring that young people have some space, have a kind of space in this decision making? Because I find it's always young people are kind of shouting from the outside in, but the difference is we don't see young people in those leadership positions, at least on a political level. So that's something that I think is crucially important to change. Even the fact that we have minister for youth after minister for youth, and they're never young, it just baffles me. So I think that's something that I wish and long to see. But also, I think even if it's difficult for recommendations to be heard by leaders, and I fully empathize, it is still powerful that when I think about, Me Too or Black Lives Matter or all these kind of things, you can look at leaders and think, why aren't they listening? This is so frustrating. But I was really heartened to see young people involved in all of these movements, because I think to myself, well, at least we can look at young people, and I'd hope, and as a young person, I think this is true, that young people are absorbing and really kind of remembering and keeping these issues at the front of mind. So even if we don't achieve it all right now, on a higher level, if we can start that conversation in young people and start them thinking in this way and realizing that their voice counts, I do think that will make a change, at least generationally. I really think so. And I hold on to that sense of hope, even when I feel disillusioned that politicians just aren't listening. And at least with the conversations that I've been having, I remember I was doing a speech and a year 11 girl stood up and said, what can I do to listen to the voices of Indigenous communities? I thought, that's so awesome that you are saying, how can I listen? As a year 11, it's not what's the answer, it's how can I listen? So already I'm seeing these movements kind of permeate into young people and what they view as important. So I kind of hold on to that as my driving force of hope, which is, again, the power of young people, I think, in being able to cultivate that optimism when we feel frustrated at our leaders.
Elizabeth's asked a simple question, but probably an important one in this context, is how do you define young?
Yeah, I mean, again, good question. And I would say this is actually kind of controversial and something that I don't think that I necessarily am the guiding authority on. People have defined it as 30 and under, as 25 and under. So somewhere around that age range, but it seems to always change depending on the kind of study that I read. But I'd say 30 to kind of 25 to 30 and under, that kind of area.
It's quite fascinating, though, that when you put those numbers on the table, that those people may have voted for 2 general elections and they're still not involved in the conversation. So we're not even getting into sort of childhood youth, are we? We're talking about actually they're in the workforce. They've been through a couple of general election cycles. They're probably pay very good rent, very good taxes for large portions of the Australian community, at least. And then there's not the forum for them to go and speak, unless, as you say, they are one of the few that go into politics and work their way up the power structure there.
Yeah.
Sue said she's 12. Nice work, Sue. I'm still holding on to my 20s, but I've done that twice now, so probably. But there are you talk about sort of beacons of hope, and I know that you've been involved in so many things, and some of that is because you are so proactive and you are a voice. But there are also many people we know, people like Ronnie Khan, who's the CEO of OzHarvest in particular, that are starting to reach out and bring that youth conversation and intelligence and insights into the conversation. So for people that are listening, what would you suggest they do if they sort of looking around and they don't see that youth voice in what they're doing?
Well, I would say, not only look around and think about young people, just look around and see if it looks diverse. I think seriously, one of the most powerful things someone can do is to consciously look around the room and think to myself, does this look not only diverse, but what society in general looks like? And that includes young people. That also includes women. That includes people of color. That includes all types of abilities. I think that almost kind of an inventory check, that kind of scan is something that, already diverse people do. So when I walk into a room, just subconsciously, I'm looking around and seeing how diverse that room looks. And I think it says a lot about a culture of inclusion and belonging. So if it doesn't look diverse, it's important to question, well, why isn't that? What kind of values are we pushing for? And are we really kind of walking the walk in terms of things about inclusion and that, again, the importance of lived experience? So I think if you want to get a young person on board, it's important to think about why. And just when I talked about the idea of tokenism, I think often organizations can kind of chuck a young person in and just say swim. But the power of and the best experiences I've had is when organizations realize, I call it almost tools and the trust, the two T's in a way. That's really important. So with Youth Congress, for example, we were taught about how to write policy, what government structures are and what they look like. We were talking to the top industry experts in mental health. We weren't just kind of put in a room and said, what are your thoughts? And I think that's really important because yes, young people have this optimism and yes, young people have ideas, but how do we almost filter it in a way to get the kind of best quality output that we can? So I think before kind of getting a young person on board, think long and hard about, okay, well, what do I want to get out of this? Make sure that's really clear. And then think about how to kind of upskill that young person. If it's on a board, providing them board training or kind of sitting them down and maybe giving them a bit extra time to explain how the structure works and operates, to kind of get that young person feeling comfortable in that space, because it can be pretty intimidating when you're by far the youngest person. Everybody's had decades of experience. And I'm certainly not blaming leaders that put young people in those spaces. I think it's good intentions, but to get the best out of a young person, it is about giving them the tools, but then also creating the space. And that's where the trust comes in. So when you're hearing their ideas, really kind of taking it on board is really important. So yeah, I would say those are the best kind of opportunities that I've seen that, and in a way, it's really transformative what it does for young people. So when I think about Youth Congress, again, somebody that has experienced, let's say, homelessness, that has now finished this program, has put forward policies to government, knows how policy works, that's seriously life-changing in terms of how a young person feels about their agency. Now they see what change looks like. Now they can go out into their communities and continue for the rest of their life to push for whatever change they see. So, it's not only helpful for the organization, but it's seriously like it changes lives. That's, to put it frankly.
There's a fine line, I think, in the conversation between advocate and activist. And sometimes the young voice is portrayed as activist as opposed to advocate, and you seem to walk that line brilliantly. And I'm sure there are frustrations in the background, but how do you balance that, wanting to, create change and advocate for it? Because to me, there's that we need both. And sometimes one gets heard about more than the other. So, we see in the media the activists, but what is actually making the change is the advocates, the people behind the scenes that are in the Congress and in the creating the policies. And do we need both, or more of one than another? How do you seem to walk this line so brilliantly?
It's a tough question because I don't even think I've really set out a roadmap to do that. But I do know what I appreciate is that my work does cross the boundaries between, let's say, NGO or more activist movements to media and to government. And that's been really helpful for me. But I don't want to kind of undermine the work of activists, because I think that it's what change is people not only outside, but also inside the institution. They both play a crucial role. In a way, it's people that are on the outside can pull the conversation in a certain direction. And I find that the politicians and people in power move slowly towards that direction, very slowly, maybe frustratingly, generationally slowly, but they're still moving. So I think it's almost not that it's a binary. They both kind of work together. So I think that's why I guess I'm emphasizing the importance of young people also being in the institution, because the reason why we're known as activists is because I think the only way young people are often heard is through taking to the streets. What other forum are we really listened to? And some of that is, positively organizations have done that, but there's still a long way to go. And that's the thing about, it isn't just this generation that's done that. This has been the reality for young people across generations. Young people are always the one that protests. We're always the one that take to the streets. And that's great and that's powerful. And hey, I'll do that when I really believe in a cause and champion that. But it's why we're wasting this resource of power, of, again, not only optimism, but future thinking and future shaping. Why are we kind of letting that always happen across generations and not really, using that? And again, maybe that more advocate side of being in that space and pushing for change within that space. So that's how I kind of see it. But hey, I've certainly had times where I've had to step back because people in power get, I guess, threatened that a young woman is being vocal. And that has happened to me. I remember, politely calling out an organization for not having diversity in its events and getting a pretty hostile response. And it was a real wake-up call that if I push too hard, these are the kind of attitudes I'll get back. But I had to realize that this is the reality. And often it's human nature that if you're calling this stuff out, people can feel really defensive. So for me, I've kind of had to temper this wanting to change everything with realizing, sometimes this is the response. And if I want to push, maybe that's a reality I'll have to accept. And often it is. I think it's still important and I'm going to continue to do it. So I think mentors have really helped me in kind of, I guess, it isn't just me kind of shouting into the void. It's me coming back to even older individuals that have been amazing in helping me navigate that, to kind of realize that, I have all these ideas, but what could that look like in practice? And kind of having that bridge has helped me. But yeah, I think that's the point of democracy, right? It's always people on the outside and the inside, kind of this interrelationship. So yeah, I think young people just have a role in both.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what a lot of this conversation boils down to, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about youth or diversity, inclusion, and some of these bigger social conversations more broadly, is it all comes back to me is just choice. And I think sometimes the certain parts, particularly of government, but also for private enterprise, don't seem to be willing to make the choice, or they're dragging their feet, or they're waiting for someone else to make the choice so they can follow rather than lead the conversation. And so, for example, when I was curating VID this year, I chose to have more female speakers than men, because it frustrates the hell out of me as a female speaker when I go and I'm only one of a few, and then I'm told, oh, it's hard to find female speakers. So I did it as a way of going, it's not hard to curate 60% women. In fact, I had to turn women away. So, but someone has to choose and has to challenge. And do you see that sort of early adopter, for lack of a better word, everyone's waiting to be for someone to do it first? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in a sense, I mean, it kind of depends on how we view it. And if I think about leadership, it's often that there are so many barriers to even being the first. And I was reading research even about, what it means to be the first in organizations, and it can be really tough. And though it's important that, let's say, there's the first woman in an organization, or an Asian Australian, or a young person, if structures have been historically created for certain groups of people, which, let's be real here, it's older white men, that's just the reality of our history, then it's really hard to create effective change when all the forces, in a way, it's really easy to kind of push you down if you're a single lone voice. So yeah, I think that being the first can be super challenging, but there is so much power in different attitudes and ideas. And Julia, I'm sure that by having 60% of women, you've heard a lot of different kind of conversations to your typical convention. I remember for me, even when I learn about something like international relations, I'm an Asian Australian woman. We talk a lot about Asia and the power of what Asia could look like, and can Australia fit in with Asia? I thought to myself, well, Asian Australians have been here since the gold rush. Why aren't we talking to Asian Australians about how Australia can integrate into the region? And it's those kind of missed opportunities that I think really is symbolic of how, for a long time, the dominating frame has not included women, Asian Australians, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, but I think to be the first requires immense bravery and courage. I spoke to Julia Gillard a couple of weeks ago, which was totally fangirl moment. But to think about everything she's pushed through is insane. But then you look back and you realize it actually gets better for the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. And it's all about, even though at the time she faced terrible sexism, she was the one that changed that idea that a leader had to be a man. So that means that the second female prime minister we have is going to expand upon those ideas and make it even better. And, just like having women at this conference, hopefully more conferences will see this and see it as a wake up call and realize, hey, this is actually looking kind of now abnormal that 70% of speakers are men. So it's all about just, I guess, creating the pattern and building upon the work that other advocates have done, and then eventually creating status quo. That's what we're almost working towards when we talk about diversity.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard to be the first of anything, especially when you mentioned tokenism earlier, and not creating that safe space and supportive. And the amount of times I see, really bad media written, or really bad copy written in social media, where you'll see, company X appoints young female or young Asian or first Indigenous person, or whatever label they want to put on the story, to get the clicks, for lack of a better word. I think we would be a lot better if we just stripped some of the labels away and just said, actually, it's not about young Australian Asian young woman, to use yourself. It's actually, where's the story? Is it that it's a young person on a board? Is that the story? That's what we want to see? Or is it, are we actually making it different by highlighting it? And would Nirvana be that it's just an accepted, really cool thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I don't think I'm necessarily against it, because in a way it holds the company in a sense accountable that, all right, now you've committed to diversity and inclusion. So now you're kind of putting this out there that you've had the first woman XYZ, but it doesn't end there. And it isn't just about putting someone in a position. It's how are we changing the culture beneath this position that is allowing all kinds of diversity to thrive. And that includes, age, but also gender, et cetera, et cetera. Are we creating space for different ideas to be genuinely listened to, where individuals can feel comfortable to voice those ideas, and people receiving them can also feel comfortable to take those ideas? Is it just one leader that is diverse, or are we ensuring that the whole leadership team looks diverse? So I welcome, in a sense, that diversity, and I encourage the conversation, because if we look at, across the board, leadership diversity in Australia, it's pretty bad. So that is important, but it's so much more than just one individual. Because if that individual's in a leadership role but doesn't feel comfortable to challenge the status quo, is there a point? The very point of diversity is to bring in different lived experiences and alternate views. So I've suggested many ways that organizations can be more diverse, and from places like creating networks of, let's say, people of color in an organization where people can mentor and network and just feel that sense of community. I think those are things that are just first kind of initial steps towards changing it from the root, rather than just kind of numbers at the top, which are important, but not the end of the story.
Yeah. I think the activist in me probably wants someone to write an article that says, company X appoints white man to board. Just see what sort of response it gets in the social media sphere. But that's me sort of going, oh, come on, please just help me out, because I would love to see the response to that article. But
amazing.
Arlene's commented a couple of times here, so I'll just go through the chat and get some of these other questions answered. So Elizabeth asked, how can we have big change in organisation when history tells us that big change and progress has to be on the streets?
I mean, I remember there was a quote, and it was by Ronnie Khan, and she said, "It isn't bad organizations, it's bad leadership at the end of the day." And the very point of companies and work is that we spend the majority of our life there. These are not things that are separate from social life. And if companies view that, then quite frankly, they're not thinking about the reality of the role that businesses play in the wider community. And that includes talking about issues of diversity. That's really important, and encouraging those conversations. And I remember I was at a working at Austrade, and they were having sessions about Asian racism towards Asian Australians during COVID, or the history facing Indigenous Australians. That was a company kind of wide event. And what I loved about that is that was showing, hey, to all colleagues, you're also involved in this conversation. And we work with these people every single day, different communities. So how can we reflect on our own maybe biases, or expand on our knowledge to, again, further diversity? So it isn't just about supporting a certain group of people. This is a company-wide conversation. And if we think about the patterns of leadership and who gets selected and what merit looks like, it's again not representative. So that plays a huge role in companies having to, in a sense, look at the mirror and challenge themselves. Because to me, inclusion is a choice. Creating a sense of belonging is a choice you have to always work on, not something that changes in a flick of a button. It's something that you again have to think about all the different forces within workplace culture. So I think from whether it's corporate to NGOs, there's an immense role to play. And again, I think about OzHarvest and the way they have me as a young person on the board, or their willingness to talk about gratitude and the idea of serving and realizing their place in helping vulnerable Australians. So I think about them, or I think about PwC sponsoring Asian Australian events. So I think that maybe this is more of, again, a generational shift, but I really think, to me, workplaces are embedded in an idea of social debates. And it's, are they silent, or are they standing up and being brave enough to stand up for, in my eyes, what is right and what needs to be changed?
As Sue's commented that we need to apply design thinking to our governments. This is 101. Go to your stakeholders and bring their voices in. Have embrace some empathy and open your ears to what's being said. So how do we get this conversation going? So policies and procedures and get created all the time, whether you're in government, NGO, NFP, enterprise, private enterprise. How do we start to design in that inclusive way?
I mean, actually, well, the thesis that I'm working on right now in final year of uni is around intersectionality, which has been really fascinating as a frame. And the idea is that it challenges who we view as the norm. So if we think about, let's say, COVID policy, it was completely lacking a conversation about gender. And then we think about the way the economic system operates, the way that women perform the majority of unpaid work. Well, this pandemic actually statistically affects women more. They're the ones that are in casual positions, taking care of kids, the first to lose their jobs in retail and accommodation. And you see the way that that gender element wasn't factored in, let's say, the budget, and the way that we didn't think about gender issues. And all that does is expand already gender inequality. So the same goes across all marginalized communities. So the thing is, it's more like, how can we kind of bring in that frame of intersectionality, in the sense that there are so many different communities that aren't heard: age, race, gender, class. How do we tease apart our idea of the normal Australian, or the normal individual communities that we're thinking about? And I think a way to do that is making sure that the team, a policy team working on these questions, is diverse. It's as simple as that. I think of, at least in think tanks in Australia that put forward policy recommendations, and to be honest, they rarely look like a diverse demographic. They're pretty similar. And that really concerns me, because I think, again, we're hearing certain things that are viewed as important at the expense of others. So I think intersectionality as a concept is a really good starting point, just to realize that when we have these broad assumptions about who is affected, let's dig a little further, and let's ensure that our team is diverse to raise those different communities that are often pushed to the side. And that's why I think I've liked using COVID as a case example, because you see how gender and age again, young people were the first to lose their jobs in the front-facing positions. These are all playing in real life. And if we don't talk about them, then that inequality gap will only continue to grow.
Yeah, there was a number of things that happened last year that whilst painful, I hope happen for the better, because it will amplify some of the differences that have been there as undercurrents, but not been severe enough for people to necessarily pay attention to, or realize that the system isn't necessarily working in the way it should for all. Sue said, as well as having diversity in the room, enabling them to go out and talk with people in the communities. Yeah, essential point. We all like talking to people that look like us. It's an inherently human thing, isn't it? Like we gather together in our tribes, in our silos, and we have to be willing to reach out and into another part to learn something new. So Yasmin, we've probably got time for one or two more questions, but I just think you're incredible. I can't believe that you're doing your final year thesis at ANU, and you've already got a CV that would make most old people, like over 30s, extremely jealous. So props to you. And I think if everyone could please pass their thanks into the chat, if you don't have a question, or we have probably time for one more before we let you go and finish writing. How many more words have you got to do on your thesis?
Too much, too many words. I don't even want to think about it, but several, quite a lot. I'd say about 10K. So it's just a semester. So
enough. Right. Sarah's saying, thanks so much for your time today and for changing the world. Impressive. Loved hearing you both speak. So Yasmin, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and please stay in touch, and we can help in any way. Please.